Hey everyone, I'm Steph. I am a 3D motion graphics artist from Sydney, Australia. So this set of tutorials is going to cover Mesh for Maya 2017 and also how it integrates with Maya 2017. The first video of this series is going to be based or geared more towards beginners to Mesh, so it'll go through a bunch of introductory things. And we'll also be breaking down one of my abstract projects, which I'll show you momentarily. And the second video is a more intermediate sort of level to, I guess, slightly advanced, in that we're going to be using things like M particles, N hair, paint effects, and 3D fluids, and integrating them with Mesh in Maya. I'm going to be covering a small bit of rendering with Arnold, which also ships with Maya 2017. So stay tuned, so you can get a preview of what you're going to be making in the first video. It's an abstract tunnel, which was a part of one of my projects called the Abstract Immersion Project. And just a still, so you can see what it looks like when it's not moving. It's just a big sort of slowly warping tunnel of very simply shaded cubes. You can see from these other sort of scenery shots that that was the whole look I was going for with this project, simple and clean, with a slightly blue hue. This is what it looks like, a slow warp of a tunnel, and the camera just very, very, very slowly translates through. So that's what you're going to be creating. Of course, you can put your own spin on it with your own colors and lights and all that. And yeah, so let us begin. Okay, so introduction to Mesh. The first thing I should probably mention is that it works with networks, in that every time you want to create a new sort of effect, it's best to sort of implement that in a new network most of the time, but that'll make sense in a second. So let's talk through some of the menus. So Mesh can be accessed from two main areas. The first one is the Mesh shelf up here. The very first button here is to make a Mesh network. The next one is really, really important, the Mesh editor. This is actually a new addition to the 2017 version of Mesh, which is great. It sort of gives us like a layer style look at all of the nodes that we've got in each network that we have. The other ones will sort of go through as we use them. Other areas we can access it is just in the effects drop down up the top under Mesh. It's really important to note that there are a lot of really useful things inside of the Mesh utilities. We'll be going through some of those in this beginner's tutorial today, so be aware that these are really useful and we'll come back to it. Mesh editor can also be accessed through here, as well as creating a Mesh network. One thing I will get you to double check though, just for what we're doing now, is to click the option box up the top here with create a Mesh network, and you want to make sure that your Mesh network, just for now, is as a mesh geometry type. If you're familiar with using things like N particles with Maya, you'll notice that it's got an instancer option, which is very similar, like adding an instance for particle emissions. So you can, instead of having your output as geometry for your Mesh networks, you can have it as an instance, which is really good for viewport performance. So if you find that you've got heaps and heaps of things in your network, and as it's animating, your viewport is sort of chugging, maybe it'll be more useful for you to switch your geometry type over to instancer. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But for what we're doing now, Mesh, that's what we want. Let's get started making Mesh network. So first thing, I'm going to make a cube. Cube is the easiest to start with. I'm going to have it selected, and I'm going to go and click up here, create a Mesh network. And because my option box default was already on Mesh up the top here, it will create it as a Mesh output, which is cool. A good way to check as well, if you're not sure, is if your Mesh 1 repro mesh here has a little geometry icon next to it, it means you've outputted as geometry or as mesh and not as an instance. It would have a different symbol in that case. So first thing to take note here that we now have is we've got some layers here available in the Mesh editor window. So this very top one here is your sort of overall top of the chain Mesh network node, and underneath that, and you can see it's underneath it in the hierarchy because there's a little bit of an indent here, is a distribute node. So the distribute node gets created every time you make a Mesh network, By default, it's on a distribution type of linear, which means it's going to push it out in that one linear direction. So just so you can see some basic control before I go into anything else, is you can increase and decrease the number of points. That's just how many of whatever you've put into the mesh network. If, for example, you increase it to 100 and you can't really see any difference, just make sure you push out your distance in X. You can put in your own values as well. You don't have to just sort of leave it on the max of that slider. Just input your own to 100, maybe even more. Nice, which is pretty cool. You can do other things as well. So you can push it out across the y-axis, the z-axis. You can change the scale, so how big or small they sort of look on each axis as well. So the scaling in X, Y, and Z, and also rotation in X, Y, and Z. Offset is just sort of whereabouts it sits on that axis that it's distributing along as well. Cool, so that's linear. The next one is radial. As you could have guessed, it distributes it in a radial method, so around in a circular shape. So I might just bring these down to 37. The distance allows you to sort of push it out in a spiral shape. Cool, so that's radial, and you can see that we've got a corresponding lobe here that sort of matches this. So again, you can change the radius of that circle and the angle, so how curly or not curly it really is. It probably will make more sense if I push the distance back to here. And if we do like 180, it'll only go halfway around. Z offset as well is kind of like what it did in the linear with offset. It just pushes it along that particular axis. So if we want to change the way it's facing, if you're not happy with X and Y, you can do Z and X, so it's facing up and down, and also Y and Z, so it's just facing on the other axis. This time select spherical, and as you could have guessed, it distributes it along in a spherical shape. So what I'm going to do is just quickly scale down my mesh network, and this is working because I'm scaling that sort of default cube, which gets hidden because it gets turned into a mesh network. Because it's still parented in the connection between it and the network, if I scale this, it'll also scale the network uniformly, which is good. That's what I want. I'm going to jump back to the waiter, which is this main menu for the mesh network. If you have multiple mesh networks, there's a different waiter for each one. I'm going to jump back to distribute. I'm also going to add more cubes. You can pretty much key anything in these menus in the attribute editor. So if you wanted to sort of key the animation speed, so it animates along the time slider up the top. By the way, yours is probably down the bottom if you're got your Maya UI set to default. So for example, if I right click and hit set key on animation speed, and then up on 120, I'll drag it up to 3 and go set key. You'll notice that first of all there's no keyframes here, but there's animation. If you want to view the keyframes or whatever you keyed over here in your attribute editor, just hit select. So that selects that whatever the attribute is in here and shows you all of the keyframes, which is pretty cool. Mine are the little light blue lines. Yours will probably be red. So yeah, so if I hit play, some pretty simple animation happening there, which is nice. Let's move on now to distributing things along a mesh. This one's probably my most favorite. Let's make it a smooth cube sphere. So you see what I mean in a second. So for example, I could just make a regular polysphere, but I don't really like the triangulated top over here at the top of the cylinder. It creates for a really sort of massive clumps of cubes along those vertices, which is slightly annoying. I'll show you what I mean actually, so I'm not just rambling. So if I have this inside of here, and I keep the vertex point and the amount of faces as how it is by default, and with distribute I change the drop down or distribution type to mesh, open up that corresponding lobe here, and if I middle mouse click and drag my sphere into input mesh, you'll see that it distributes it along the surface, which is cool. So if you do vertex, for example, you'll notice now that what I was talking about earlier with the mesh network being quite clumped at the poles, which is kind of annoying. If you want more of an even distribution, you could just have it on scatter, which is just it scattering along the surface. You can change it to scatter using face area, which is pretty good for a slightly even distribution in comparison to having it turned off. It still does clump towards the top. If we increase the number of points to something a lot, that is a lot, like 4,000, and we hide that sphere, so that's just Control H after selecting it, you'll see we have a pretty good distribution of cubes across the surface. What I'll do is make a cube as an example, scale it up. I'm going to turn off this mesh network, and it's not deleting it, it's just hiding it, just like how you would out of the outliner. Think of this little switch as a visibility on and off. So what I'm going to do is just smooth this cube, so that shift right click smooth, increase the divisions, and I'm going to use a sculpt deformer just to push it out so it's sort of a perfect sphere shape. I got this handy tip off of one of Ian Waters' tutorials for MASH, which was really useful. So, delete history, so we don't have a connection between the sphere and the deformer that was there before. It deletes it for us once we do that. Now I'm just going to make a new MASH network. I'm going to go make a new cube. If I go to wireframe view, you'll see that just in there. We'll make it another MASH network, and you can see that it appears here as MASH2, which is spectacular. Gonna click on distribute, just gonna tap 5 just to go back to shaded view as well. Making sure in MASH2, change your distribution type to mesh, or alternatively, you can even skip that step and you can just drag in your, I think it's P cube 2, yep. You can just drag in your P cube 2 with the middle mouse button to input mesh, and it automatically swaps it over to mesh, which is really useful. So now if we have it on vertex, and we increase the amount, oof, that's probably too much. Probably maybe here, or maybe if you just put flood mesh on too, it'll fill every vertex that's available, which is handy. I'm just going to hide this cube, or now sphere, and just click on it so you can see what you got, and scale these down. Oops. Scale the mesh network down. There we go. Perfect. So you can see this is a really nice even distribution of cubes across the surface in a different kind of pattern from what you get from that original mesh network over here. So if I hide this one and change this distribute to vertex, flood the mesh, you can see that it's very sort of radial, and that's just because of how the wireframe is really. If this sphere was more dense, I think it was, sorry, if this, there we go. If this sphere was more dense in terms of its vertex count, then you'd obviously have more of a fuller sphere if you're using that vertex distribution mode. So, yes, it's going to hide this now and bring this one back. Okay, so other methods, pushing along. You got random vertex as well. If you don't have flood mesh on, if you have less of these, it sort of just creates more of a random, again, distribution of things. Cubes across the vertices. Face center fills the face center of all the faces on this piece of geo. The more you have, the more you'll obviously see. So another cool one you can play with for that method is voxel. If you've got a model that is quite large in scale, you got to be careful of just loading times, or just how long it takes to calculate the volume inside of your geo, so be wary. So moving on, so we have edge. Edge is pretty nifty if you want to create some interesting outlines. So if you don't pick, see, flood mesh is cool, creates like a checker, but turn that off. If you have just the right amount, 192, look at that. So if you have like the perfect amount to go on the edges that you want, you could create some really interesting warping outlines for polys, or even for, you know, type mesh, which is cool. So let's carry on. That's enough of distribute, I think. In the next video I'm going to be jumping into some cool stuff like paint effects as well. That's really fun to play with. Okay, next thing. Let's look at some of the other nodes we can put into this network via the mesh waiter sort of window in the attribute editor. Cool, so mesh, let's get some influence happening here. So influence is great in that you can sort of make things disappear and appear based on a little locator, and you can animate that and do whatever you want with it really. So if I click on it and go add influence node, you can see that we've got influence here under mesh 2, which is cool, and by default it's actually created an influence locator for us, which is awesome. So I want to be on the mesh 2 influence node. So the influence radius is sort of like an area of effect, so increasing and decreasing this value is like increasing and decreasing the size of a I guess a radius of how much this is influencing what is within the radius. So 100 is sort of the max you can put here. You can input your own values in. Strength as well, that's just kind of like opacity. So random strength is cool, so it affects them differently, so it's not really a uniform global effect. Cool. Alright, so what I might do, making sure all of these are turned on as well, so whatever you do here overwrites the previous scale and previous rotation. If you click on your influence locator and move it around, it affects your mesh network based on where your manipulator is moving, which is pretty cool if you want to animate it going around in a crazy circle. If there's a particular motion that you want this to have, you can sort of get a little bit fancy and add it to motion paths and things like that, or to curves, but for now we'll just add some basic keyframes. Very quick. But it's pretty cool. It creates like a flashing effect for the outline of this shape. You can imagine if you put like a glowing shader on it, whether you're using Arnold or another external renderer, if you make it a mesh light, or make it emit some sort of glow, that would be pretty cool. Also scale affects this too, so if you scale the locator, it'll affect the scale and also the rotation of what you've got going on in your mesh network. So that's a cool thing to play with as well. So if you key that a bunch of times, so maybe we'll affect it in the Z axis with scale, and we'll just key that. I'm just going to hit S because S just sort of keys everything in the channel box. You can see that over here by all of them being tagged with red. Just as we're doing this real quick. If you had the camera animating around it too, you get some pretty cool effects. Anyway, I'll stop with that. So that was fun. Other thing you can do now is, let's look at adding another node. So we'll keep that, we'll just keep adding on top of it and see what we get. So let's add a replicator node now. Replicator is cool in that you can add replicants of mesh networks without having to duplicate them physically over here, because you don't really want that. So add a replicator node, make sure you've selected the right mesh network, and inside of here you can see that by default nothing really happens because our replicant is on 0. So you just want 1, you can tick 1, and you can see that it just sort of offsets it by -2 and DZ axes. So I might go Y 1920, so it's sitting directly above. You can offset the rotation and stuff too, which is cool. So what I will do is might rotate this around in Y. You can also animate this as well. So let's keyframe this rotate replicants. So what I'll do is maybe add a couple more replicants. Maybe we'll have 3. Cool. You can also rotate them in other degrees as well to get some weird orbs. Cool, okay, so let's just hide that. Scale can also be changed. So you can see this is actually like very, very, very flexible. Okay, next one we'll have a look at is the, oh, this is my favorite one, the signal node. So signal is a really great way to get some quick animation happening to your mesh networks. It animates things based off some math that goes on in the background. So we've got a couple different types for signal types. We've got 4D noise, looping noise. I don't want to try pronouncing this because I always get it wrong. I'll try. Fractional Brownian motion. Cool, I got it. And then trigonometry. So let's have a play with some of them. What I'm going to do first is probably leave it on just 4D noise for now because that's what it's on by default. And let's just play it and see what we get. I might just disable that influence node just so you can see what it looks like without that on. That's also another really cool thing to note, that you can turn off things in your mesh network without actually breaking the chain, which is really good. And what I might do though is just scale it up a little bit. Alright, now back to signal. So those default settings are actually pretty good. I don't have to play with too much. You can change the amount that it moves in X, Y, and Z, which is spectacular. Change it to whatever you want. If you want it to be crazy and whack, you can. If you just want it to be subtle, that works too. So nice. Okay. Rotation can be changed, so it will rotate on each axis. You can kind of see it moving if I just zoom in. So rotation, you can see it there shifting. Scale can be changed. I usually always have uniform scale ticked on just because I think it looks a little bit better, but if you want to tick it off, it's going to read all the scale values differently. The reason why I have it usually off is because you get these sort of flickering faces due to Z fighting, because it squishes faces so close together that the viewport can't decide which one to display on top. So that's usually why I have that turned on. Noise settings. Octaves is cool. Sort of gives it more of a variation of movement. The next thing we'll play with is the step amount. So by default that's on 150. If you bring that back, you get some really interesting effects, especially on the lower end of the scale, because it keeps it as more of a fluid movement. Tries to sort of keep them together in a wave almost, in comparison to sort of speckly noise. Noise scale, again, is sort of like enlarging whatever sort of step you've got here. So I'm going to leave this noise scale down. Now time scale is cool. This creates a slower animation speed. So if you give yourself more frames to work with, you can get more variation out of that. And obviously the opposite, if you turn it up, it gets quite fast. It's just the amount of times that it plays through whatever animation you've got set up here in your settings. It does become a bit of an issue though if you've got it on something less than 1, if you've got looping. Strength, again, you'll see this pop up in pretty much all nodes. I'm saying pretty much because I haven't tested all of them to see if they're all there. So that allows you to sort of implement how much this node is affecting the network, and also still allows you to plug in a strength map, which, like I said, sort of acts like a map which tells this node where on a UV map to affect, which is pretty cool. Great, so let's just pause this animation, and now let's go and have a look at looping noise. Now looping noise is pretty cool if you want to output something to, say, I don't know, a game engine. You want to do some effects and you want something to loop perfectly. So there's two things you got to check for, and that's that your loop frames here are the same as how many frames you want to loop through up here. So if you only want to loop through 120 frames, this has to have 120. Mine's on 210, so I just want to make sure my loop frame ends on 210, so I get the whole animation that's happening from frame 1 to frame 210. Timescale 1 just means that that animation is going to loop once from this frame to this frame. So if this one, fractional Brownian motion. This one's a bit fancy in that it sort of creates a really cool pulsing effect. Usually if you bring your step amount down, or maybe in the middle a bit more, and then noise scale, there we go. You can create some really cool fluid movements with this. Then trigonometry, my old fave. So if you hit play, you sort of just get some pretty wacky, generic noise-like animation here. If we go into trigonometry settings, so it's a bit of a trick. You kind of think it's open just because it's underneath here, but it's not. Just make sure you tick that. These are some different mathematical operations that it bases the animation off that you can choose from. So what I might do is bring the step amount down so it's a little bit more visually aesthetic, at least in my mind. Time scale. What I'm going to do is change some of these so you can see what they do. So the x function, so that's what it's going to be doing on the x-axis, so let's turn around so we can see it a bit better. Let's change this to cos. So based on the x-axis now, it's sort of animating a little bit differently. And tan, we'll throw it out to the side of the x-axis. If you want, you can sort of change the way the scale affects it so it's not so crazy. So put this back to sin. Same with y. If you increase the step amount too, it sort of gets a little bit more detailed in terms of how that noise looks. Now let's go back to mash the waiter, and let's add in an offset node. So where is offset? Here. So offset is good just if you want to do like a general sort of rescale or resize or anything like that. You can do it over a period of time, which is cool. So mode, if you do multiply by time, it'll sort of change the value based on where you are in the time slider. Change the offset scale to 0.1 in Y and Z, and I have it on multiply by time, so if I click play, it increases those scale values over a period of time. You can decrease the strength as well, just so it's not as harsh. You can also do that with rotation and position. Offset in general just does it once and doesn't sort of do it over time, so if you just want to change the scale real quickly to your mesh network and have it set like that for a period of time, the offset one, and also overwrite as well, will work for that. Let's quickly put in a transform as well. So let's just say we need to move this somewhere else in our scene, because you'll notice if you grab the repro mesh and move it, it kind of breaks it and nothing happens. So don't do that. We want to add a transform node. So click add transform node. There's two things you can do here. You can make your own locator and drag it into controller null, or just right click and go create. And that will create another transform locator. It'll name it for you nicely, which is good. And if you click on your transform over here in your mesh editor and grab it over here, you'll notice that you can now move your mesh network around and rotate it and do all sorts of crazy things. So it's just a handy thing if you want to move it around. Just remember that it's the values in the channel box for that transform locator that you need to zero out, not the repro mesh or the mesh network that you're zeroing out. It's the transform locator. Now what we'll do is something a little bit more wacky, and that is have this be attached to a curve. So I'm going to create a spiral curve, and this is the easiest way in my mind how to create one. Sorry, that's the creating a helix. All we're going to do is grab an edge and go modify, convert, polygon, edge to curve. And look at that, we now have a curve pulled out from the helix. So I'm just going to delete the history on the helix and then just delete the helix. So cube, mesh network. Cool. Distribute. Go back to mesh 3. I might duplicate this curve so I have a separate one to use. And then add a curve node again to the new mesh network. And you can see because I had it selected already, it just sort of added it by default for us, which is great. There you go. Now you can keep traveling around, and because it's sort of spraying out to the side like this, we just want to go back to distribute, change the distance here to 0. And if we also go back to curve and click ignore step, it pretty much is almost like hitting flood mesh when you're using the scatter method or vertex distribution method for mesh, which is pretty cool. Going back and changing the amount will also affect it. If you want to go and add a signal to this now, that's always good, so you can get some noise happening along the curve that's smoothing. Changing the step down so it's a bit more wave-like in scale. Get more of a wobbly, jiggly curve. So I might leave it at that for now, and we will come back momentarily and start creating our own abstract tunnel. Okay, now it's time to make our own abstract tunnel using the tools that we learned in the first half of this video. So what I'm going to do is start with a brand new scene. The first thing I want to do here is make a cylinder. And the cylinder is going to be the width that you want your cube tunnel to be. So I'm just going to scale it around and rotate it. Jump into your top view, scroll out, and what you're going to do is grab a curve, CV curve, so create curve tools, CV curve tool, and I'm just going to do a really slight bend, a slight S shape, so I'm going to grab the front faces of this cylinder, hold shift, click the curve, and then extrude that face along. Now the key with this is that we actually need to have quite a few divisions because the cubes are distributed along this mesh based on the vertex amount. So I'm just using multicut, just going to add a few in here first, then I might use insert edge loop to add more than one. Now what I want to do is just make a cube. I'm going to scale it up a bit more just so we can see what it looks like when we make it into a mesh network. And now this time I'm going to make it an instance mesh network. Get my mesh editor back now. Click on the distribute node. There we go. Change it to mesh. I'm going to drag in my cylinder to input mesh. Have it on vertex and hit flood mesh. Cool. So this is why you want to have a whole bunch of edge loops. I actually think I don't have enough. Vertex, flood, look at that. And if you had this on mesh, it would have taken a bit to process, but because I have it on instancer, it was quite quick to load, which is good. So I'm just going to change the size so it looks a bit more like this. If you want to see a little bit better how much they're overlapping, just turn on wireframe over shaded. You can get a bit much for you to look at. I usually do it to about here. Turn it off. You see it looks quite hilarious over here. There's one setting you'll want to turn on, and that is use up vector. So what that does is pretty much look at the normals of each particular face or vertex and then rotate each object or instance based on that. Okay, next part for me is I will go in and actually animate the subtle movement of that tunnel first before I do anything else. Next bit is to start getting some noise happening on the actual mesh network. So mesh 1, signal, add signal node. So let's see what we have by default. Increase the amount it moves in Y. I might play with the noise scale now and maybe make it, or actually the step amount, see what it looks like if I bring it down. So I landed on this following setting, so octaves 1, persistence of 2 point, let's just round that up, 2.5. My loop frames are 120, step amount 0.05, so quite low. The noise scale set to 5. Alright, so now we are almost done with this mesh network. I'm going to show you how to cache it in a moment and put it into a new Maya scene to light and render, but before we do that, let's just add a little bit of variation to the movement of the tunnel. Turn on the mesh network, might turn off this. I'm going to jump to each frame and see what it looks like. That's cool. Look at that. Getting sort of sucked in and smaller at the back and increasing in size. Now let's learn to cache the network. So first thing you want to do is, because as you can see it's currently an instancer, we want to convert it back to a geometry mesh network. So up under mesh, utilities, it's going to break that off. We want to grab switch mesh geometry type. First we've got to select the waiter. Thank you, handy hit. Those hints are great in case you forget something. And then we'll go mesh geometry type, switch, and look at that. If I close this, you see that we now have mesh repro mesh in place of the previous, which was a instancer. Cool. Alright, so let's cache it. So this button up here, if you click it, it's like cache mesh network, which is pretty cool. Click this, grab the waiter, click this, and it automatically just shortcuts to the Alembic export, which is great. Grab that. Because I'm doing frame 1 to 120, you can have it on time slider. I kind of like inputting my own, that's just the habit I'm in. So you can see there, 120. These are fine. Cache time 1 to 120. Export selection, and then it will prompt us to pick somewhere to save it to. Maya successfully churned out that nice Alembic file for us, so I'm just going to jump in, make sure it's in the right spot. So you can see what I'm doing. It's going, navigating to my default projects folder, cache, Alembic, and there it is. So let's import that in a new scene for the purposes of lighting and rendering it. So this is officially going to be our lighting and rendering scene and window, so I don't need Mesh Editor anymore. It's always good to have the outliner open though. So I'm just going to set my project real quick to the default project window. Just make sure it goes there because I want my renders to go. And I'm going to import my Alembic file. So jump over to the effects menu, cache, Alembic cache, and I'm actually going to reference it in just because that's my preferred workflow. However, if you are used to importing things directly into your scenes and that's the way you're doing it, please go ahead. Both of these are fine. I just always reference. Cool, so I'm going to reference in my Alembic file and whack it in there. Should be able to play through quite easily now, which is good. Play through. Bleh. Nice. So, gonna hide my grid because I don't need it, and I'm gonna turn on anti-aliasing just because I can, and why not ambient occlusion? No, gross. Let's create a camera. So create cameras, camera, And for now I'm just going to create one that moves in the tiniest bit. I just always increase the size by the way of the gizmo, just so I can actually see what my camera see where it is really. And I'm also going to go change my layout, so side by side. Consider I am recording just the one monitor. It's best to have it set up like this so you guys can see what I'm doing. So perspective in one, camera one in the other. If you're not sure what I did there, just middle mouse click and drag the camera into the viewport. It's just a quick way of swapping between cameras. So first thing, I'm going to jump in and just put in a test resolution for my camera. By the way, before we go on, I'm rendering with Arnold, which comes built into my 2017, which is spectacular. So I just hit my render settings button. I'm on Arnold renderer. I'm going to scroll down and just change my my resolution just for test rendering for now to HD 720, because that's all I need it to be while I'm testing things. So I'm going to also put on my resolution gate, which is this button up here, so I can see exactly what I'm capturing. There we go, it's nice. This is sort of I guess a bonus tip, if you like. In the attribute editor for your camera, and you go down to display options, you can change your gate mask opacity and color. If you're like me and like to customize things to be slightly purple, I don't know if you noticed, but my Maya is slightly purple. You can do that kind of stuff here too, which is useful. I always do this, just makes it easier for my eyes to see. Okay, so my camera is over here. I've got it selected, tapping F so I can sort of focus on it. And what I might do is change my focal length to something a little bit more extreme, like 15 is way too much. 30. Focal length of 30. Just so it's a little bit more elongated. And I'm just going to put in the animation first. So I'm going to start just inside the tunnel. I never want to have the camera tilted so you can see the other end of it down here. Just want to have it here. Nice. And what I'm going to do is, I can see I've accidentally already put a keyframe here, so let's just get rid of that. Jump back to frame 1, and I'm going to hit S while the camera is selected, and then move up to where I want the camera to be at the end, which is going to be not too far in, maybe about here, and maybe slightly rotate it, very slightly. Yes. Cool. Mesmerizing. I think I like this one more than the original one I did. Cool. Alright, so we've got a camera in there, which is great. The next thing I'm going to do is add some lights. Because we're using Arnold, and this has currently got a Lambert assigned to it, I'm just going to assign an Arnold shader, so the standard one. So let's right click, I'm going to come down to assign new material. Just a quick way to add a material rather than just doing through the hypershades straight away. We are definitely jumping in there at some point though. Arnold, AI standard. Default settings for now are fine. And I'm going to add in, I think I'm going to start with the HDRI, just for some sort of global lighting first, just to see what sort of pokes through and what doesn't. So with Arnold, if you want to add a HDRI, click Arnold, Lights, Skydome Light. So by default it's just a sort of white dome, but you want to have an image to input in there. So we are up to adding a HDRI. As I mentioned earlier, there's one particular website that I always go to get ones that are pretty good, actually, for free ones. It's called the SIBL Archive. This is what their webpage looks like. So color, add in file, and then click the manila folder. It'll automatically open source images of your set project. Cool. Now, because I don't really like seeing it in the background, I usually work in wireframe. There are other options though, if you don't want to do that, like adding this HDRI to a layer, putting on transparent or reference, something like that. But I'm happy with this. Alright, so we're going to do an IPR and just see how that lighting affects our scene. So let's just on our AI Skydome over here, I'm just going to increase the exposure to 1. Maybe a bit more. Because I do want my scene to be a bit more exposed. Also because we are going to be on the inside of this tunnel. So I'm going to change my camera to camera 1. And of course, because we're inside and the light is all outside, there's not really much going on inside here. Alright, so this is what we have so far. Pretty speckly, but it's okay. I haven't changed any of the default render settings, so what can you expect? But that's okay to start with. The HDRI is pretty good. Now we're going to add some internal lighting. I'm going to make a sphere, and I'm going to make the equivalent of a sphere light just to see how that lights up the space. I'm going to move it back a bit more, sit it in here. I'm just going to see how it moves as the tunnel moves. Good, not too much at all. So that'll be fine. I don't have to animate this. At least I don't think I do yet. And I'm going to make this a mesh light, or Arnold's equivalent of creating a mesh light. Go down to Arnold, change it from polymesh to mesh light. I usually have light visible not ticked on, at least in this case anyway, because I want it to act as an actual hidden light source. And what I'm going to do is bring this back over, refresh the render, hit play, and I'm going to update the exposure live so I can sort of see what I want it to be at. Alright, so all I've done in the meantime is just duplicated it around a little bit more. Here we are, let's do a test. Alright, we can see that sort of coming through here. Okay, so what we're going to go through in this video are some material settings and then just some basic render settings. So, without further ado, let's just open up the Hypershade. Alright, so let's get our AI standard one, that's what's applied to the cubes, and let's push it out and have a look at what's involved. So if we click on it, it'll update over here. Just for the sake of tidiness, I'm just going to call this default cube matte for material. I do want this to be a white color. I just want to have a slight sort of specularity, glossiness to it. So I'm just going to come down to that specular lobe, just increase the weight of it. A good way to see how it's affecting everything is to just render as you go, really. I might bring the specular down a bit more, 0.35. If you want to have some subsurface scattering, just to have some, an internal colour sort of look like it's sitting beneath the surface, like maybe some sort of nice blue, we'll just see what that looks like. I'm just going to stop it here, because you can see even from just when it's finished that it's still very speckly. So there's a couple settings I usually change before I do anything, before I start going too far, and that's the light samples, because we do have a lot of lights in our scene. So the next thing I'll do as well, jump over to our render settings. I'm going to add some AOVs just so I can do some troubleshooting to find out where all the noise is coming from and start adding or increasing settings from there. So I don't want to just I don't want to jump in here and just make the camera AA 6, because that's crazy. You want to actually work out what's causing your noise and fix those specific things. So AI scan is what I'm AI standard is what I'm using. Some of the ones I'm going to look at are direct diffuse, direct specular. I do have subsurface scattering, so I might just look at the default one for that. Indirect diffuse, indirect spec. I'm not using reflection or refraction opacity, so that's about it. So they're all there, they'll be active now. I'm definitely just going to quickly jump into the Arnold renderer, get rid of volume indirect, leave subsurface, get rid of refraction, just because I'm not calculating those in my scene. Down to ray depth, same sort of thing. I don't need reflection, and I don't need refraction. Cool. For now I'll leave it at that. I'll just keep it over here. Alright, so as you can see, this is almost finished rendering. You can see over here, still got a bit to go. But let's just jump through or cycle through our AOVs to see where our issues are. So direct diffuse, you can see we do have a bit of fuzziness going on. It's best to say at this res. Around here in these sort of areas that aren't really well lit. Let's look at the indirect diffuse. Wow, super fuzzy. So we need to add in some values to here to diffuse, but before we do that, let's have a look at everything else. Sorry, we need to increase the value here. So you can see as we cycle through direct diffuse and indirect diffuse that both are quite fuzzy, so we need to increase the value in diffuse in the Arnold renderer window. Let's have a look at spec. So direct specular is pretty okay. Indirect spec, really fuzzy, so that's us having to increase the glossy samples. Cool. Subsurface is, this is why I'm reluctant to use it, because you really have to bump up that sample, sorry, the samples that you use for subsurface scattering, which adds a lot to render time, but if it gives you the effect you want, and I guess it's worth the wait, so let's just put it back on beauty. What I'm going to do is just save this snapshot as well, just down here, so when it updates we can see the difference. Alright, so this is the final result that I ended up with. I did change all the settings from that previous video. Ray depth is just 2 and 2 for diffuse and glossy. To be honest, I'd probably go back and increase this to 4, just because I think it would probably render a better result, because we still do have a lot of noise in the shadow here, but that's stuff that can be fixed in comp, so I'm not too worried. So that's it. Thanks for watching, guys.